Okay, so the next couple of weeks we have five parshas left to the book of Exodus. So that's almost half. What did we discuss in the book of Exodus till now? We had the story of the slavery and the liberation. That was about four portions. First, third, I guess, and then you had two portions about the giving of the Torah at Sinai, and then last week all the civil law that followed the giving of the Torah. And now we get to the final theme. What's the final theme? The final theme is the story of the construction of the temple, the movable temple, portable temple in the desert. And the Torah dedicates a tremendous amount of time to that, no less than four portions. So if you want to take about the amount of real estate, it's a little bit more than the Exodus, you know? So the Exodus is a very important part of our tradition, our religion, but also our understanding of what being a Jew means, to be free. Um, it doesn't seem that it's all that interesting to spend all those verses and words on the details of constructing the temple for God. And like I said, it's repeated at least twice. And in no less than four portions. So this is obviously the Torah considers this to be a big deal, and we want to try to unpack and uncover what is the why is it so significant, and maybe more important, what is it? How is it significant to us today when we do not have a temple, at least not in the physical sense. So that's the big idea. That's sort of where we are in the book, where we are in the Torah. I just want to say that don't be totally upset that there's no drama because in the middle of these four portions, there's one portion that you have a tremendous amount of drama. That's the portion where we read about the sin of the golden calf and the shattering of the tablets and this God giving the people, forgiving the people ultimately and giving them the second pair of tablets. So there is a little bit drama left still in the book of Exodus, but it's sandwiched between four portions, which seem very technical and very detailed about the construction of a home. So there's a lot to say about the construction of a temple and what the significance is. There's many, many things to say. I prepared at least three things to say. Hopefully, we can at least touch upon each of them. Um, we have a little text translated into English. Maybe that will help, but we'll jump right in. But in the meantime, if anyone has any comments or questions on the temple or on the book of Exodus or in general, please don't hesitate to jump in. Otherwise, we begin. So the first big idea, if you want to think about this, is if somebody comes to you and says, God needs a home, we have to build a home for God. So we may be used to it because we think of, where Judaism has had a temple ever since they left Egypt, and then there's a temple in Jerusalem. And then once the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed, now we have what the Talmud calls miniature temples, mikdash ma'at, little holiness, meaning to say that when every time you have a study hall or a synagogue, it's like a miniature temple. But by the way, the first 1300 years of Judaism, there were no synagogues. There was the temple in Jerusalem or in other places, and the mitzvah was the pilgrimage. You go there three times a year, but you didn't go have a synagogue in every town. And only once the temple was destroyed did they institute that you have places to get together to study Torah and to pray. And that's what we call synagogue, but we call that a miniature temple. So we're very used to the notion. But if you think about this for a second, and when it was first introduced to the people, in a way, it's the most absurd thing you could say. You could say that God is going to rest within a specific home. Now, God is infinite. And if God is infinite, then no home could contain him. And in fact, when King Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem, which was far more grand than the temple that they had in the desert, he actually says a statement. So the Torah gives us the description of what he said when they inaugurated the temple. And one of the things he says, he talks about the idea that it's strange that the way King Solomon says it, Hashamayim u'shmei Hashamayim lo yichakalucha, the heavens and the heavens and the heavens cannot contain you. Right? God is infinite. So even the entire universe can contain him. And then you're going to say, and this home will contain God. So the notion that God needs a specific place to call home is something that has to be um, under, analyzed and understood and thought about even before we get to the specifics of how do you make a home and what does a home mean. But that idea that there's going to be a specific place that can house God, if God is everywhere, that's the first thing we want to address. Now, once we explain that, we'll explain while we're at it, we'll explain will explain the concept that in Judaism, if you think about it a little bit deeper, you realize that the question is not just an anomaly about the temple, but really it's a question about many ideas in Judaism, because many ideas in Judaism tell you that God is accessible and is present in a very specific set of circumstances. If you do the mitzvah precisely in this way, but if you do the mitzvah a little bit different, then God is not here. God, holiness is not here. Then God doesn't dwell, right? You say every mitzvah has so many laws that come along with it. And everything has to be done the exact same way. If you put the mezuzah on the left side of the door instead of the right side of the door, it's not valid. If it's not valid, it's not holy. So if you think about it, we're starting. The question is about the temple because the temple is the most obviously absurd that God needs a home. As if, first of all, does he need a home? Second of all, will he fit in the home? I mean, spatially, but I mean, how could a physical space contain him if he's infinite? But if you think about it a little bit deeper, it really applies to every mitzvah. Every mitzvah. There isn't a mitzvah in the Torah. I guess maybe there is. Maybe most mitzvot in the Torah, just to be safe, have very specific definitions and must be kept in a very specific way. And the question is, how could the finite God be accessible only through a very specific and finite um, avenue? And like I always say, a lot of people, religious people, and spiritual people have a problem with Judaism for that reason. And some of the breakaway religions also broke away from Judaism, and part of their critique against Judaism was this point exactly, that we become a faith of law, where everything is regulated, and there's less emphasis on spiritual ecstasy or emotion or touching, transcending the physical. But we insist, no, you want to want to connect to God, it's got to be in a very specific way, in a very physical way, in a very specific way, and only that's the way you're going to touch the infinite. So that's the paradox of Judaism, and we're coming to it from the story of the temple, and we'll try to introduce an idea or two, maybe read it inside, and then we move on to other concepts also related to the temple. But this is the question. You've been studying Hasidic philosophy for a while, so maybe it doesn't keep you up at night, this question, because it may be obvious to you. But if you want to say a big idea, this is a big idea because this addresses the question, this addresses a very central point about Judaism in general and our understanding of Judaism and the path to connect to God, which is, as we will see, it's very different than other spiritual traditions think about these same ideas. So that is by way of introduction and introducing the question. And now we could start thinking about what the answer is going to be, and maybe we'll find a text that will help us read this. Okay, so I guess I'll introduce the idea, and then we'll read it inside. The idea is not new to somebody who's been studying this for a while, but it's still always good to go back to the foundations and the ideas that are at the premise of everything we do. So the Hasidic idea is as follows. When you think the question is premised on the idea that there is the two categories. There's the finite and there's the infinite, and they're two distinct categories, and the finite cannot contain the infinite. And that's a logical premise because the infinite is too great to be expressed within the finite. So that's logical. The deeper idea is what the Hasidic interpretation introduces, is that infinite does not capture God. Infinite is also a definition. If you say God is infinite and therefore he cannot express himself within a specific detail because he's too great, then you are limiting God. You are confining him to the realm of infinity, and you are removing him from the realm of finite reality. Now, this was very common for philosophers who believed in God, Greek philosophers and many other philosophers, and they understood that their thinking process was, if there is a God, that they believe there is a God, but God is infinite. God is too great to care about specific, maybe even creation as a whole, but certainly specific behavior of specific individual people. Like to say, God cares what I eat for breakfast, or God cares if I pay my taxes. It's an absurdity because God is infinite. And God is worrying, no, he's not worrying about God, the creator of the universe is the true essence. He doesn't care what I do when I'm walking down the street. And that's a very logical idea, but that comes from the notion that there's finite and there's infinite, and the infinite does not find expression in the finite. But the Jewish perspective is, or certainly the Judaism is premised on this idea, even if it wasn't articulated till later, till the Hasidic Kabbalists and the Hasidic philosophers. But Judaism is premised on the idea that that's not the case. Because if you say God is regulated to the infinite, you are limiting him. And the true essence of God is removed both from finite and infinity, and he's not bound by either one. And if he's so great, he can actually express himself in the finite just as he could express himself in the infinite. So that's one idea. It's also premised on the idea that in the Kabbalah, we say something that whatever is the highest falls the lowest. And there's all kinds of metaphors for this. So, for example, one metaphor would be the metaphor of the falling wall. So let's say this pen is a wall, and the cover of the pen is the top of the wall, the top bricks. Now, let's say this wall collapses and falls down. So what happens is the stone that was the highest fell the furthest from the wall because this is the base of the wall. And the Kabbalah uses this to explain that something to fall very low has to actually have a very high origin. And there are other metaphors. Metaphors would be, let's say you are a great teacher and your ideas are so sophisticated. So they say, well, you can't teach in high school. You have to teach in graduate school. Okay, wonderful. That means you're very wise. That means students of a lesser degree will not be able to understand the complexity of your ideas. Okay. But if you're a true genius, says the Kabbalah, if you're a true genius, the true genius is one who can articulate his ideas both to a graduate student and to a first grader. And if you cannot articulate your ideas to a first grader, you're not as wise as the person who is able, because he is so high, he is able to descend so low. Because if you're going to say, I'm so smart, I can only speak to sophisticated people, then you're regulating yourself. You're defining yourself by relative infinity. I can only speak to greatness. I can't speak to people who are intellectually unsophisticated. But the true wisdom is to be able to really get to the core of what you're saying and be able to explain it to every person on their level. And we're going to call that beyond transcendence. You have transcendence. I'm above the limitation. But going beyond that means I'm not limited to be beyond. I'm not limited to the infinite. I could be in the finite. And that's going to be the idea. The temple is, because we're talking about the essence of God, it is not absurd for the essence of God to be in the physical because the essence of God could be anywhere. It'll be wherever he wants to show up. And he wants to show up in the finite reality because he wants to relate to us. But to say that he's removed from finite reality, you're not doing him any good because you're also trapping him in a definition. And the definition is infinity. And the one thing we know about God is he has no definitions. So if he has no definitions, you can't regulate him to the definition of infinite. So that's one big idea. I want to read one paragraph, I want to read maybe one or few paragraphs here from a talk of the Rebbe in English that captures this idea, and then we can go on to other angles of the temple. I just want to say that there's a mitzvah, there's a statement in the Talmud that says as follows. It says, "Makom ha'aron eno min hamidah." The place of the ark did not count, was not measured. In other words, the measurement of the ark was not measured. What does that mean? It means that the way the sages say it in the Talmud, there was a miracle in the Holy of Holies. The holiest place in Judaism is the temple, and in the temple is the Holy of Holies, the place where the ark stood. Now, the Holy of Holies had a certain dimension, and the temple in the temple in the desert, it was 10 cubits by 10 cubits. So let's say I was 10 by it was 10 by I think it was 10 by 20. I'm getting confused. Either way, there was a measurement of how wide the temple was. The dimensions of the room. Now, the ark itself also had dimensions. It had to be 2 cubits by 1 cubit. I'm sorry, 2.5 cubits by 1.5 cubits. So the ark has a halachic size that it has to be, and the room has to have halachic size. But the Talmud says if you measured the ark, it's 2.5 cubits. If you measured from wall to wall, I think it was 10 cubits. If you place the ark in the temple and you measure each side, you'll have 5 and 5. In other words, a miracle happens that the space of the temple, the space of the ark does not take up any space. And exactly what that means, there's debate if it means as I described it or not. But the way the Hasidic interpretation says, the space of the temple could contain something that's beyond space. And that's the whole idea. The space of the temple is the infinity that captures the infinity expressing itself in a finite space. And that's why that paradox is there is space because it can only happen, this miracle can only happen in the holiest place, which is the Holy of Holies. But in the space, you're above space. So you have that bridge between infinite and finite. And the idea is going to be that the same is true for everything, any mitzvah. Any mitzvah, later he expands it not just to a mitzvah, but anything we do in the physical world with a spiritual purpose becomes like a temple for God, becomes like a home for God. And that is greater than just a spiritual experience, because a spiritual experience remains in the realm of infinite. But when you have a connection between the physical and the spiritual, that means that the origin is a higher space. Because again, what is higher falls lower. So that's the big idea. It applies to the temple, it applies to almost every mitzvah we will do. But that's idea number one. We'll read it inside, we'll read some of this inside, and then we can go to other ideas associated with the temple. But in the meantime, comments or questions, please join. Otherwise, I'm going to share the screen. Please present. Otherwise, I'm going to share the screen. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. You mentioned that most of the mitzvot have to be done in specific ways, but there are some mitzvot that have like related to our thought. For example, love your God, or something that related to thought that it cannot be regulated.
Correct.
So is that how you kind of connect to infinity? Because the thought can go further than the.
So that's a good question. In other words, that's why I hesitate to say every single mitzvah, but they say like this. They say even mitzvot that are more spiritual in nature have to have an expression in the physical. And the example is thought is a good question. So we'll leave thought for a second. We'll leave that to the brain experts, to the neurologists. But before that, let's start with a simple thing, like a mitzvah of the heart. You have to love your fellow. You have to love God. So you say that's not a definition, but we say no. It's a practical mitzvah. Why? When you love somebody and you see them, you're happy to see them and you're excited. And what does that do? Your heart rate goes up. Okay. So maybe your doctor's not happy because your blood pressure goes up. But that's what happens when you're happy, when you love God. So in a way, every mitzvah, yes, there are some mitzvot, there are six mitzvot that are related to thought, and there are mitzvot related to emotion. And there, maybe you can't regulate it as much, but it has to have an impact on the physical world. It's not a completely transcendent experience. Say, I love God. You love God. Okay. Did it affect the pace of your heart? See what I'm saying? So it has to be attached to something physical. Now, a thought mitzvah is also, but I would argue, yes. So you're right. Those mitzvah. That's why I hesitated. Instead of saying every mitzvah, I said most mitzvot. But even that, there's regulation of, for example, Torah study. It's a mitzvah of thought. But how much do you have to study? So it depends on the person. But there's regulation. If you have time, if you don't have time, if you're busy, if you're not busy, if you're earning money, if you're not earning money, right? There's all kinds of regulation. So yes, there are some mitzvot that minority, overwhelming, a small minority of the mitzvot are more spiritual, and those it's harder to define. But I would argue that there could be still definition. But most of the mitzvot, it's very, very regulated. Everything has to be done exactly in a specific way.
But what I was thinking is does it parallel to ark doesn't take any space? So there are some things in our uh, practice in mitzvot that kind of connect us to divine, to infinity more than others.
Right. So I would argue that the opposite is true. The more physical the mitzvah, the more it's the ark doesn't take any place, because the ark doesn't take any place is basically the merging of space and beyond space. And what we're saying is that happens anytime you take something physical and do something holy with it. So how do you define this? Is this a materialistic aspect? Is this a materialistic thing, or is this something that is infinite in a finite space? That's messing with the idea of infinity and finite because the definitions break down. the space of the arc is above space basically is saying that space itself collapses, but it only collapses in a certain space. And the paradox is if the arc wasn't 10, and the arc and the, if the arc if the chamber wasn't 10 by 10 and the arc wasn't 2.5, then this miracle wouldn't happen because it's not a mitzvah. So only when the mitzvah hits those definitions do you have a collapsing of space, of space and beyond space coming together. So it was one place where where we believe that you could actually see this miracle, but conceptually, this is happens anytime you do a mitzvah. Anytime you do a mitzvah, it's an absurdity. You're saying that the infinite God is present in a finite act. It's an absurdity. But the space of the ark is doesn't take up any space is also an absurdity. But we're comfortable with absurdities because basically what we're saying is if you're not comfortable with absurdity, you're saying that there's finite, there's infinite, and they cannot connect. And that's a very logical, philosophically logical position to be in. But the Kabbalistic idea is that there are things that transcend these definitions. And today we can understand it because today we know that science is not as philosophical as we thought. It's not as logical as we thought. Science is full of paradoxes, especially when you get to quantum mechanics is full of paradoxes, and we're more comfortable with paradoxes. But the Torah has been saying this before people were comfortable with paradoxes, and we're trying to give a framework where this is logical because we understand that the higher the thing is, the lower it can go. And if you're going to say, I'm such a smart person, I can only speak to people with PhDs, you're very smart, but you're not as smart as the guy who can also speak to a first grader.
Thank you, Rabbi. Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
Okay, so let's read a little bit and then we'll see if we can go at least one more topic because this is more philosophical, but there's also a lot more to say. Okay, thank God we have another few parshas to read about the Mishkan, the temple, and we have many more years and decades of good health to study Torah, so we don't have to cover everything on one foot. That's the good news. Okay, so this is a translated essay from the Rebbe um, about this subject. And when did it come out? I don't even remember. Probably. And when did it Rebbe say this? That's a good question. We're not going to read the whole thing. Don't worry. There's no test. Don't worry. When did it Rebbe say this? 1962. Okay, fine. Yeah, we can sit on this text for the next 2 weeks. I just want to read a paragraph or two and read the answer. Here we go. Okay, beyond transcendence. I'm going to read and hopefully I'll try to explain also. And if you have any questions, don't hesitate to jump in. Okay, the clarification of this matter, of the matter depends on a well-known spiritual principle. Where does this spiritual principle come? Okay, from a Hasidic principle. Goes like this. The loftiest rung descends to the lowest of levels. The higher the thing is, the lower it can fall. The very fact that God's indwelling is associated with specific limited material places, the sanctuary and the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple, indicates that the level being drawn down is so lofty that it can be revealed only when drawn down below to the very lowest rung. Okay, this is even a deeper point. Some things they're so great, they can only be expressed in a very low way. What do I mean? So let's think of an example. Let's say you love somebody very much and you want to express the love. So you can talk to them about how much you love them. You can buy them a card. You can buy a Hallmark card, okay? And sometimes they have the texts that are written in, and then you don't have to write anything. And if you really love them, maybe you'll write something. Today you can ask AI to write a letter for you, but I don't suggest it. But yeah, you could do that. So there's the idea that if I love you, I can express it in words. And that's fine. That's beautiful. But sometimes there's a love that's much deeper, and some love actually cannot be expressed in words. And here's the paradox. The love that cannot be expressed in words, how do you express that? You express that with a physical, either gesture or a hug or a kiss or an act of intimacy. That's so what the Kabbalah is saying, 1 second, what just happened here? What just happened here? The emotion was so great that it cannot be expressed in the more elevated parts of self, which is speech, but it has to be expressed in action. So that's the same idea that we're saying here. We're saying that because we're talking about the loftiest levels of godliness, the essence of God, it cannot be expressed specifically through a spiritual idea. It has to come down in the lowest way. To explain, God is infinite in the most ultimate sense. He is not bound by any limits, neither the limits of finite space nor the limits of transcendence. And this is a very deep idea because this is an anomaly. This was radical. Most philosophers believed that God is transcendent. God is not capable of knowing and caring about what happens in the finite space and what an individual person, one person out of billions of people, is going to do in one specific afternoon. It's absurd to think that God is in the limited space and not transcendent. But we're saying no. We're saying God is not bound by any limits. He's not bound by the limits of space, but he's also not bound by transcendence. Just as God cannot be defined within the limitations of space, so too it is impossible to define him as transcending space. You can't say he's in space, but you also can't say he's outside of space. You can't say he's transcendent. For transcendence is also a specific definition, which implies certain limitations. Among them, that the very fact that it implies something unlimited above space and does not possess the potential for limitation. So in other words, if you say something must be unlimited, you're limiting it. That's the paradox of infinity. You say, I am infinite. You're infinite if you mean, but when you say you're infinite, if you mean is you're not able to express yourself in the finite, then you're not infinite, then you're limited. Because being unlimited is also a limitation. God, by contrast, is above any description that defines or limits him in any way whatsoever. Only where space and transcendence, finiteness, and infinity come together, when opposites emerge, is the power of God's essence manifest. He is absolutely omnipotent, transcending impossibility, nimna hanimnaot. We can talk about that in a minute, a philosophical term, and can fuse opposing elements. This fusion creates a setting in which God's presence can rest. So I'm glad we read this inside because this is adding layers of sophistication. God is not infinite. God is not finite. Where do you know that you have the essence of God? Only where those two things meet. Only in a place that you have both infinite and finite together when the opposites only in paradox. God could only exist in a paradox. So while all the philosophers are trying to explain everything and they say God cannot be in the finite space because that's a paradox, what we're saying is the only place that you could sense the essence of God is in a paradox. Because what does a paradox mean? A paradox means that the definitions, the usual definitions, break down. So if you say infinite is one thing, you say finite is something else, you say they merge, that's a paradox. That's where God exists. And this leads to a big debate that the sages had, the philosophers of the Middle Ages had. We're getting a little distracted, but I'm going to read one more. I'm going to talk about this, and then we'll read one more paragraph inside. The Middle Age philosophers Jewish philosophers had a debate whether you could say whether God defines all definition or not. Nimna hanimnais, whether it's possible to say that God, could you say anything? Could you say something is impossible to God? Could God, in other words, could do anything, but does that include only rational things, or is that or can God also do the absurd? Could God make a square that's round? It's absurdity. Could God make the child older than the father? Absurdity. In other words, mess with cause and effect. And there were many Jewish philosophers who said, like Maimonides, who says God has nimnaot. There are things that are impossible for God. But then there were most of the Kabbalists who said, no, to God the impossible is impossible. In other words, you're saying that it's impossible because it's an absurdity, it's because it's a paradox. We're saying that the paradox is where the essence of God is found. Because if you're going to say that I can define exactly what God could do and what God cannot do, then you're not talking about the essence of God because the essence of God defies definition. And now we're getting back full circle to the temple, but not just to the temple. Later on in the essay applies it to all commandments, but not just all commandments, but anything we do in the physical world that we do for a spiritual purpose. You're really fusing the finite and the infinite, and you're really touching the essence of God and making a home for the essence of God. So let's keep going. This is a novel development that occurred within the sanctuary and the Beit HaMikdash, the Holy Temple. On the one hand, the sanctuary and the Beit HaMikdash were limited by the confines of our material world. They existed in a specific space. Similarly, the curtains used as a roof, the boards, the sockets, and the other elements of the sanctuary all had specific measurements, as did the Beit HaMikdash itself, and the utensils used in both structures. Moreover, these measurements had to be adhered to exactly as specified by Torah law. There could be not a slight deviation. In other words, the temple itself is the ultimate of specific regulation. It's only holy because you did this in a very specific way. If you change the dimension or the measurement, it's not holy anymore. So on one hand, it's very specific. On the other hand, together with this emphasis on precise measurements, an element of godliness which transcends limitation could be seen overtly in the sanctuary and the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, there in the temple, we believe there were miracles that you could actually see. One of them is this collapsing of space, where, well, in general, the Mishnah says within the limits of these structures, transcendence was revealed, demonstrating a fusion of the finite and the infinite, limitations and transcendence. As the Mishnah states in the Ethics of the Fathers, the Mishnah states that there were 10 ongoing miracles in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. So that's in general. There were miracles available. But now we're going on specifically in the Holy of Holies, the primary element of the Beit HaMikdash. There was a unique and overt miracle. This is a quote from the Talmud. The space of the ark itself was not included in the measurement of the chamber's length. In other words, again, you have the chamber's length, 10 cubits. If you bring the ark in, the ark is 2.5 cubits. But if you measure from one side of the ark to the other, you'll have 5 and 5 and 5. So it's really 12 and a half if you try to measure the whole thing. But that's, again, the point is it transcends space. Okay. The ark was 2.5 cubits long and 1/2 cubit wide. In the Beit HaMikdash, there were 10 cubits from the western wall of the Holy of Holies to the ark, and 10 cubits from the ark to the eastern wall of the Holy of Holies. He's talking about the temple. In the temple, it was 10 cubits. In the Mishkan, it was, maybe it was also, okay, I'm getting confused. Either way, and yet this width of the entire chamber was 20 cubits. Oh, this is the temple. The temple was 10 and 10, so it's 20, but if you put in the ark, you'll be able to measure 10 on each side of the ark. Thus, the space of the ark did not occupy any space when measuring the span of the Holy of Holies. This revealed the power of God's essence, which alone can fuse space and transcendence. And later we say that's true about the temple, it's true about every mitzvah. And then we're going to say the most important thing is that really, figuratively, every person is making a temple for God when they take something physical and use it for a spiritual purpose. It's the figurative home for God. And there too, you have the fusion of something physical and something transcendent. And in a way, that's where you know you have the essence of God. So in other words, the paradox is like this. The mitzvot that are more spiritual, that's very nice. That's a spiritual experience, but that's not the essence. The essence is specifically when the spiritual and the physical merge, and you're doing something physical that is infused with the spiritual purpose. So conceptually, from the Hasidic perspective, that is where the essence of God lies. And that's why we are very different than any religion, because all religions are trying to transcend. And we're not trying to transcend. We're saying if you're trying to transcend, you're locking yourself in a box and you're locking God in a box. You're saying God is only transcendence. And we believe God is transcendent, but he's not only transcendent. And the essence of God is where transcendence can express itself in the physical sense. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Oh, thank you, Rabbi. This is actually a very beautiful idea and makes sense. But was also thinking that this is as paradoxical as the creation, right? Because creation is something from nothing. So that's where the physical and spiritual intersects the first time at
Yeah,
the time of the creation.
from the perspective of Kabbalah of Hasidism, that's correct. Creation itself is, in a way, the physical. So it depends who you ask. When you ask the earlier Greek philosophers, they didn't believe in creation. They believed that the physical material always existed, and maybe God just sort of starts the process of the development of how it evolves. But they believe that the physical existence of the world always existed. Um, that's really what science believes. The philosophers believe really up to the Big Bang Theory, which says there is a beginning, which is more consistent with the Torah. But either way, from the perspective of Judaism, yes, the act of creation, all the spiritual worlds that the Kabbalah is very excited about and loves to discuss, all the spiritual worlds are an expression of God's light and not an expression of God's essence. God's essence, paradoxically, is expressed in the physical. So yeah, these ideas overlap, indeed.
Okay.
Okay, I'm going to say one more idea. Maybe we'll stop a few minutes early, but this is a powerful idea that I said a few years ago. But I think it's very nice to think about because again it relates to the idea of what is the physical world and what is the temple and does the physical bring us closer to God or further from God? So there's all kinds of ways that the Kabbalah does business, meaning the way the Kabbalah finds meaning. And one of the ways is the Hebrew letters. Kabbalah is very interested in the Hebrew letters, and every Hebrew letter has an energy, and every letter is also has a numerical value, represents a number, and you can find connections by either connecting words that have a similar numerical value with the numbers of those letters add up and they reach the same number, or if sort of you change the order of the letters and you can scramble it and unscramble it, and you can find connections between words that seem very different and maybe even paradoxical, but there's a tremendous amount of meaning within these word connections. So case in point, and one very beautiful one, is in this week's parsha. So if you think about it, the primary material that was used for the temple is the walls, because they had a roof, but the roof was sort of temporary. The roof was just wool or hides of animals, skin of animals. But the strongest part of the structure was the beams. There were beams that were stood up, not like a log cabin when they're horizontal, they were vertical, and they're standing up, and there's all 48 beams lined up to make the three walls. So says the Kabbalah, and the Zohar points this out, says the Kabbalah that the word for keresh, the word for a beam that the Torah uses in the plural kerashim, but it's keresh in the singular. It's very interesting because the Zohar says that these letters, first of all, there's two layers. One layer is that if you scramble these letters, you get to the word sheker, which means falsehood. So the beams somehow represents falsehood. And then I'll tell you something very cool about the letters that the Zohar says. Let me see if I can just find a quick chart of the alphabet so I can display this. Um, um, let's look at a chart. Visit. Okay, let's see if we can do this. It may not work. I need the letters the way they are in the Torah. Sheker. Okay, it's going to work for most of the letters. Okay. So here's an interesting teaching from the Zohar. Says the Zohar as follows. There are some letters that represent truth and some letters that represent falsehood. What does that mean? So if a letter stands on 2 feet, it's truth, because 2 feet means it's going to last. If a letter stands on 1 foot, it represents falsehood, because falsehood doesn't last. There's a statement that says sheker ein lo raglaim. Falsehood doesn't have feet. It can stand on 1 foot, but eventually it's going to collapse. So the Zohar says, for example, the letters resh, 1 foot. The letters kuf is on 1 foot. Each one is on 1 foot. The letter shin, here it's on a long base, but in the Torah, this long base comes down to it's all standing on one little leg. There's one little leg that comes out of the letter in the Torah. So these 3 letters are letters of falsehood, because they each stand on 1 foot. What letters do they make up? Here it says sheker. So each letter is a falsehood, and then all 3 letters combined make the word sheker, which is a falsehood. Now, why am I saying this? Because they also make the word, if you read it in order, keresh, the beams of the temple. So somehow there's falsehood playing around here. So let's deal with that in a second. Just to make the Zohar's point, letter Aleph, 2 feet is truth. Letter Mem, 2 feet is truth. The letter Taf has 2 feet is truth. What does Aleph, Mem, Taf stand for? Emet, truth. There's another teaching that emet, to be true, is to be consistent. So emet is the first letter of the alphabet, the middle letter of the alphabet, and the final letter of the alphabet. So there's all kinds of interesting allusions playing with the word truth and falsehood. And going back to these words, keresh can either mean a beam for the temple, or it can mean falsehood. So what does this all mean? So we're talking about how the physical space is really the expression of the essence of God. But let's ask a very basic question. Is the physical reality, is it a truth or is it a falsehood? So, of course, the answer is it depends. On the surface, the physical world is telling you a lie. It's falsehood. Why is it falsehood? On many levels. Because what does the physical reality tell you? The physical reality tells you that I'm here and I'm permanent, and there's nothing more to reality than what you could see and touch. And that's the story the physical world is telling you. But that's not the real story. The real story is that it's a creation. It's an expression of the creator. That the physical world is supposed to direct you and say, wow, if creation is so beautiful, if science is so sophisticated, if the universe is so grand and so beautiful, what it's supposed to do is tell you not, here, I'm a painting and I painted myself, but here, I'm a painting and therefore get to know the painter, right? So, but the problem with the physical world is the physical world by itself is not telling you the true story. It's not telling you the true story about its existence. It's also not telling you the true story of what's good for you. In the physical world, many things look very enjoyable, and really it's going to kill you. It's poison. And there are things that are healthy for you, but they don't look good. They don't taste good, right? So, in other words, the physical world is, in a way, is all about falsehood. What the Torah is telling you, how do you make a temple for God? Not by escaping the falsehood. You're actually taking those same letters that represent falsehood, and if you rearrange them, and now they become a temple for God, and now they become truth. In other words, the same material, if you use it for a higher purpose, it stops being falsehood and it starts telling you the true story. It starts telling you the true story of its existence. And this concept has tremendous ramifications because almost everything in this world is, I don't want to say neutral, but because neutral is neither or, but I would say really it's one or the other. It's either making you a better person, or that same object could be destructive, right? It's either anything, any asset you have, it's either it's serving you or you're serving it. Either it's serving you or you enslaved to it. And every example, every single thing in the world is either a sheker, it's either a falsehood, pulling you away from your own truth. But if you use it, if you take control of how you want it to be used, then you're actually taking that same object that could have been false, and now you're making it a keresh, a beam that's going to hold the truth of God in this world. So there's no such thing as good and bad. There is such thing as good and bad, but most things are, it's up to us and our awareness to elevate it from a state of falsehood to a state of truth and to a state of making a home for God. And that's where the truth resides. Go ahead, Vicky.
Thank you, Rabbi. Such beautiful ideas. Thank you very much. I just want to clarify. I think Shin has two legs or one
Not in the
because
Torah.
it's
In the
not in.
Torah, on the chart, it looks like it has one, but it looks like it has a very wide base, right?
I
So it
see.
looks like it's very like the Fei has a very wide base, Tzaddik has a very wide base, but the Shin in the Torah, it's much more like this Shin. You see this Shin? You see how it's coming down to one little corner. See what I'm
I
saying?
see. Yeah, yeah,
So in the
yeah.
Torah, it's actually more like that. So it's sort of there's three branches, but it's all holding on one little dot. So the Zohar has this whole thing where those letters are letters of falsehood, and that's
Yeah, maybe that represents kind of a transition because we now display it differently. So there
yeah.
is a mix,
So but but
but
but
the
the, but the point
idea
is
is
this: the point is, Vicky,
beautiful.
it's not that it's something else. The falsehood itself could be a house for truth because
I
falsehood itself is only the surface. On the surface, it's falsehood, but really it's truth. It all depends on the observer, right? If I look at a painting, whether or not it distracts me from the painter or it brings me closer to the painter is entirely up to me. Right? But the physical world, it's not exactly true. Spiritual identity. Let me rephrase that. Spiritual existence. Almost the definition of spirituality is it tells you it has a source, and the example is light. If I'm sitting in a dark room and there's a ray of light coming in, I know the sun is shining, or the moon is shining, or a light is shining. Light indicates that light indicates that there's a source. But other materials don't indicate that there's a source. It says like it was always here, right? So that's why the physical could be classified as falsehood unless you rearrange it and then you see how if I take $1 and I give it to charity, now this dollar is actually telling a story of kindness, telling you a story of transcendence, telling you a story of God. So it's the same,
beautiful.
it's the
Yeah,
same element. It's not a different element. That's what consistent to what we were saying earlier, that the infinite itself is where the infinite rests, right? So the physical itself, the falsehood itself is where God himself rests.
beautiful. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Vicky. Have a wonderful Shabbos and a wonderful day. Thank you.